Hello and welcome to this episode of the Millis Podcast, a show about ideas, books and events from the Christian intellectual scene in Australia and beyond. I'm your host, Simon Kennedy, and I'm the director of the Millis Institute and senior lecturer in the humanities at Christian Heritage College. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. And I am joined today by Dr Sarah Irving-Stonebraker, who is Senior Lecturer in Modern History at Western Sydney University. She is a graduate of the University of Sydney and Cambridge University, where she did a number of very clever things, including getting her PhD in history. She's an intellectual historian, which I think is an excellent thing to be myself. And she has worked until recently in looking at British imperialism, natural science, and Christian theology and the interplay between those. Her first book was published back in 2008 with Routledge, Natural Science and the Origins of the British Empire. However, today we're going to focus on Sarah's more recent research on the history of religious freedom, which was the topic of her 2020 Richard Johnson lecture. Welcome to the Millis Podcast, Sarah. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I guess it might be good to start with some background. Could you just, going back a step, back a step from religious freedom to your research that you've done previously, could you summarize for us why you have an interest and had an interest in imperialism and science and Christianity? You published a number of really interesting articles on this, and you published a book about that. Can you tell us more about that research before we get on to religious freedom?
Yeah, sure. The interesting thing about why I'm interested in history of science and Christianity and imperialism is actually that they are three of the most profound forces that have shaped our world.
Right.
And actually, even this goes a little more deeply to some thinking about the way that history is such an important force,
Right.
and that we have very little historical understanding. Increasingly in a culture that has no sense that history has anything to teach us. And we know from statistics that fewer and fewer students are taking history at high school and at university. And I think for various complex reasons, our culture is one that no longer sees historical forces as having much explanatory power or indeed any kind of normative significance anyway, in terms of having anything to teach us. And so for me, when it came to studying the history of science and empire and Christianity, it was really about recognizing that these forces have had a kind of influence that we haven't recognized, particularly actually in their interaction too. So like some of my early work was looking at the relationship between science and the origins of the British Empire and Christian theological ideas. And that kind of interaction had been sort of completely overlooked.
Right. And so have you found yourself more interested in one of those three? Like, do you consider yourself a historian of Christianity or a historian of imperialism or of science? Where do you see yourself sitting in those three, do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. Increasingly, I'm becoming more of a historian of Christian ideas more generally.
Yeah.
It's funny because originally, when I was doing my doctoral studies, I wasn't a Christian at all. I was an atheist, and that's another story, and I won't go into that. Yeah. But actually, at that moment, I was much more of a historian of imperialism and the history of science. Yeah. But it was actually through a process of studying and engaging more deeply with texts from really the 17th to the 19th centuries that I recognized and become more interested in the significance of theological ideas. And that's kind of carried through into my more recent research as well.
Yeah, great. And so you've recently pivoted your research to what seems like quite a different topic, the history of religious freedom. Now, I know that you've always been interested in intellectual history broadly and history of political and legal thought, and you've published some articles with your husband, Jonathan, on political and legal thought, and Christian legal philosophy. What prompted you to address this new question on the history of religious freedom and religious liberty and the foundations of those?
Yeah. This was actually prompted by a sense, and actually kind of connects back to what I was saying about our sort of impoverished knowledge of history as a culture and as a society, of just how much our contemporary political debate and thought in the public sphere is, like, on the one hand, we're fascinated by ideas about religious freedom and rights and so forth. And yet it struck me as a historian that Australians knew so little about the history of those ideas, such that they would kind of bandy ideas around that actually made no sense historically and bore no witness to what was actually real. So, for example, people would talk about having a kind of, like, almost as if everyone had a kind of inherent right to all kinds of freedoms in Australia. And it's like, no, that's actually not the case at all.
Yes.
And so it's just this kind of sense that, oh, wow, this is such an important contemporary idea. And so much of our contemporary, even broader than religious liberty per se, but even a broader sense of some of the debates at the heart of our discussions in our contemporary culture about, like, what is a human being? Are human beings valuable? Do we have inherent rights? Who has these rights? It's actually such a fascinating phenomenon that we're obsessed about these ideas and yet know so little about them and about their history. And so, for example, this is where the history of Christian thought, I think, is so important. Very few people recognize that actually the very premise of a universal right that belongs to all people, regardless of who they are and so forth, is at its heart a Christian idea and relies upon a, Judeo-Christian understanding of a God who has created all people in his image. That kind of knowledge. So, we just don't have that knowledge. So my interest in this kind of current project is kind of to say, well, hold on, we've got this fascination with religious liberty in Australia, and there's some great kind of legal discussions. Some of my colleagues who are in the kind of legal field here, some great legal discussions, and yet, interestingly, like, historically, we don't know much about religious liberty's history in the Australian context, and even much of the legal discussion sort of starts with the Constitution in 1901. It's actually comparatively late in the Australian historical context. So it's like, oh, where did these ideas come from?
That's great. And I'll come back to the Australian context, I think, in a minute. But you gave the Richard Johnson lecture in 2020, which was and this was with the Centre for Public Christianity. It was probably the best produced Richard Johnson lecture, but it was probably the worst attended because it was during lockdown. But it was a great lecture, and people should check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes. And in that lecture, you raise an important historiographical issue about the claim that religious freedoms, our idea of freedoms, and this comes to what you were saying, I think, about a misunderstanding around where freedoms come from. But you raise this issue about the claim that freedoms, like freedom of religion, were products of the Enlightenment, in inverted commas. You don't think this claim's accurate? Can you tell us more about that and about where you think the idea of religious freedom comes from, historically speaking?
So look, basically there is a kind of, to put it again, to kind of, reduce very complex historical phenomena kind of quite clearly for the purposes of this. There's a kind of myth, to put it simply, that the idea of all our kind of rights, particularly the idea that we have a right to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, stems from the Enlightenment, so from the 18th century. And even then, there's this kind of sense that this period of the Enlightenment, this is a kind of popular myth, was really a kind of secularizing moment in which humanity kind of freed itself from the authorities of religion. Actually, the reality is much more complex than this. And so, for example, like the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, that famous document of the French Revolution, speaks about the fact that no man will be disturbed for his opinions and so forth. The American Declaration of Independence talks about the fact that we all have inalienable rights. But the interesting thing is that though there are these kind of rights claims, underpinning them is very clearly, particularly in the case of the American Declaration of Independence, there are by no means Christian documents, or the authors like Thomas Jefferson, who was the primary drafter of that document. And yet there is this premise that the rights exist because they are endowed by a creator. And so, there's this kind of myth that they came from the Enlightenment. Actually, the truth is much more complex and has actually a much longer history. And really, our idea about the sense that humanity has a right to what we now call sort of freedom of conscience. And that in itself has historically entailed a kind of what we might call like a bundle of related rights. So the freedom of conscience, the freedom to exercise or kind of practice one's conscience, and the freedom to not have a religious position imposed upon them and so forth. Those kind of bundle of rights have an incredibly long history, and actually really our modern, like our understanding of conscience and how important it is to what our sense of humanity is actually dates back to a biblical understanding of the importance of conscience.
Yeah. Okay. So can you tell us a little bit? I mean, it's a lot, as you said, it's a long and complex history. So I'm not expecting you to give us a book length summary of the history, but you've hinted now that there's a kind of Judeo-Christian underpinning, there's a biblical underpinning. I'm going to ask about the role of natural law in a minute in all of this, but how have historians, do you think, typically dealt with this question of the emergence of modern rights up until now? Has it, because I've read people like Samuel Moyne, for example, has acknowledged that Christians were deeply involved in the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And someone like Larry Seedentop's written a great book on the inventing the individual, where he sort of claims that actually a lot of this spade work really was done philosophically before the Reformation, before modernity for some of these rights. So some of this work's being done, but do you think that you're wanting to, I think, unpack a little bit more of the early, you want people to be more aware of the early history of this as well? Is that correct? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. There are excellent studies by an increasing number of historians who have recognized, like you said, the kind of theological underpinnings, and in philosophy too. So like people like Jeremy Waldron realize even underpinning Locke's conception of equality is, important theological point about humanity.
Yes.
But yeah, like my point really is to talk about the fact that there is a kind of intellectual tradition here that goes beyond this kind of, and it's excellent to do this kind of case studies at particular moments, and also to talk about, like, so for example, the illustration you gave of Christians being involved in the writing of the UN Declaration. It's actually a lot more profound than that, in the sense that there's a theological tradition here that has underpinned these ideas and continues to. And moreover, part of this interesting history is that those ideas get secularized too. And even talk about secularization, that's a very loaded historical term. There's all kinds of literature on that. But part of the fascinating history is, interestingly, some of the claims, like that example I gave before about rights, kind of persist, and yet their theological undergirding is increasingly kind of denuded.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's really good. I'm really interested in these questions in my own work as well. So it's great to hear more about the theological and Christian basis for these ideas. It's really, really good to hear that you're working on this stuff. One of the things that you speak about at some length in your lecture, the Richard Johnson lecture, is the role of natural law jurisprudence in the forming of modern human rights. And you make the claim that natural law, or the jus naturale, provides a theoretical foundation for human rights through the role of the conscience. What have you been discovering about this in your historical research? How does the conscience play a key role in the formation of our modern concept of rights?
Yeah, this is such an interesting one because, again, there's such a great literature on the history of the natural law tradition. But increasingly, what I'm finding is that there is a very unique position accorded to the idea of conscience, in the sense that conscience is related to the core of what it means in the, again, to use kind of broad term, but the Judeo kind of Christian tradition. Conscience is really lying at the core of what it means to be human. And therefore, there's a kind of sense that conscience is a kind of lies at the heart, therefore, of any kind of right that we might speak about as belonging to the human being. And the really interesting thing is that this understanding really goes back to the unique formulation of the importance of conscience in the early church and even in biblical literature.
Right.
So, like, I'm not an ancient historian, but ancient historians, and so well-known classicists and experts in this field, have looked at the way that conscience bears in the New Testament writings a kind of significance that it doesn't have in the classical world. And even as a historian who's not a classicist, even when you read the emphasis that, say, that the Pauline letters place on the importance of being persuaded in the mind, and even with the broader historical knowledge, recognize that in terms of the fact that the Christian church grows as this really historical novelty where it is the only religion, no necessary connection to somebody's ethnicity or their class or their gender or even the state.
Yes.
And so it's really about, so you convert and you become a Christian based upon the persuasion of the mind, based upon the conscience.
Yes.
And that then through all kinds of, complex constellation of ideas and developments in late antiquity and then in the medieval world, that sense that human beings have this kind of right of conscience are increasingly what is at stake when people are kind of writing about even the rights of collective groups as well, that they might have the right to practice their belief system. So for example, in the medieval Holy Roman Empire, there are various kind of small groups who are granted, this isn't religious liberty per se, but they're granted a kind of religious toleration, the freedom to kind of practice their beliefs.
Right.
And it is related to this idea that the conscience is at the core of all of this.
Yeah, really interesting. And a question that flows, I'm just going to spring this one on you, Sarah, if that's okay. So a question that flows from this for me, and this would probably be quite a common kind of historical objection, maybe to what you're arguing is, but weren't Christian polities and Christian kingdoms actually quite not like they didn't give people religious freedom, and so even though you might say there's this idea, the ideas are there, they weren't put into practice. Is that fair to say, or do you think that Christians have been good at this up until recently?
Oh yeah, no, that's right. That's absolutely right. Yes, of course. So just because there is a sense that conscience might be a right that pertains to the individual, that is a very kind of limited claim. And it's really important to point out that in the medieval and the early modern world, and really right until the late, and really things start to change in this sense in the 18th century, it is overridden by the fact that, or held in tension is probably a more accurate historical with the fact that there's a completely different understanding of what the polity is and what are the individual's duties towards society. So for example, like if you look at Martin Luther's writings, talks about the idea of conscience, and yet at the same time there is, and this is one of those things where we kind of really have to think our way out of the way that we understand the government today in terms of like the origins, authority, and the jurisdiction and the limits of the government today and its purpose. In the early modern world, there is only the sense that societies can be peaceful if the state takes upon itself as its responsibility to maintain religious order. And by religious order, they really mean one dominant.
Yes.
And so like rights of conscience are always kind of held in terms of like being limited by the importance of the state. And even often there's a kind of distinction too between conscience and like what we'd now call like free exercise. All kinds of early modern writers have this kind of really quite fascinating insight where they can sort of talk about the fact that like even if you look at Hobbes, like
Hobbes, I was just thinking of Hobbes actually.
You can hold these ideas, you just can't practice them. So we have freedom of conscience. So like there's this recognition that freedom of conscience is important, but the notion of how free exercise, the practice of religion or free exercise might work in an early modern society is completely different to modern societies. Because we have since the 18th century and really into the 19th century, when you realize that a lot of this has to do with the repeal of all the privileges and rights of political rights of the Church of England in the 1820s and 1830s.
Right.
There's not a sense in the early modern world that there can be a kind of religiously plural society in which there is no dominant religion. They don't have that kind of a secular sense of the polity.
Yeah.
That we have. Yeah. So it's always held
Yeah.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I would never want to kind of present this in terms of like Christian polity is always protecting religion, because that would be so anachronistic. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's that's a very helpful explanation. So you basically said that there's what to us is a fairly foreign idea of the role of what we call the state versus the individual conscience, and those two things being held in a different kind of tension in the early modern period and before that to what they are today. And hence why we look back and we go, oh, this is, they're bonkers. And so someone like Luther and Calvin, I mean, Calvin talks about the conscience quite a lot as well. And yet you look at Calvin's Geneva and it doesn't look to be doesn't look to be like there's a lot of freedom of practice going on in Calvin's Geneva. But what you're suggesting is that it's actually the way that they understand the role of the state that's significantly different as compared to today. But the ideas of conscience are actually still like there's quite a rich doctrine of the conscience. Is that fair?
Yes. And I think one thing that really kind of sheds light on that, that was a really nice summary that you gave, is the fact that in today's world, we tend to think of political theory, we sort of begin with the individual.
Yeah.
And we tend to think of the state in terms of protecting individuals' rights, because we inherit a history from Locke and so forth. And so we kind of begin with the individual. And so it's so, like you said, foreign and counterintuitive and strange to us. And it almost makes no sense to look in the early modern world and think, no, they actually don't begin thinking that the fundamental political category is the rights-bearing subject. Like we begin from that premise today. And what I mean by that, in case I've sort of employed a bit of political philosophy jargon there. So what I mean by that today is, look, today we begin by thinking that we think in terms of the role of government and so forth, in terms of beginning from who is the fundamental political unit. It's really the individual, rights-bearing individual. In the early modern world, they think about the Christian world, in the West, they think about the polity. They think in terms of the church and in terms of communities.
Yes. No, that's good. That's really helpful. All right, so we're going to go now to the modern concept of human rights and what we understand as freedom of religion today. And so the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights enshrines freedom of religion as a fundamental human right. And so we think it's important, but in Australia, we're in the midst of this quite complex, weighty debate about freedom of religion. And this is particularly impacts things like Christian schools. It looks like that's it's going to start impacting. What have you been discovering? I'm going to get sort of zero in on Australia now, not so much about modern contemporary issues, but what have you been discovering about Australia and the way that freedom of religion has been discussed in Australian history?
Yeah. Okay. It's actually really interesting. The first thing, this is kind of like a broad statement and insight, is that actually freedom of religion and conscience was discussed in an animated fashion in Australian history. And that's actually kind of a counterintuitive thing too, because for a long time, this kind of sense, and it's kind of immersed itself in our identity too, that Australians don't particularly care much about ideas, particularly religious ideas. And yet actually, historically, there has been quite an animated discussion.
Fascinating.
So for example, if you look in the colonial period in the 1830s, for example, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there are all kinds of discussions in the newspapers at the time about freedom of conscience and free exercise and so forth. So like after, so in 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act, as it was called, basically enables Catholics to have the right to vote, to stand for Parliament, and so forth. And this is greeted with all kinds of, really for like almost a decade.
So this is in the UK?
But of course it affects Australia, colony. And there is all kinds of discussion about this. And there are other events too that mean that we're sort of talking about conscience and rights heavily. And it's actually not just people who are sort of who we would perhaps from our perspective in the 21st century look back and call religious, quote unquote. So there is discussion in like radical newspapers, like the People's Advocate, really famous radical newspaper in the 1840s. There's a discussion about the fact that, so Lionel Rothschild, who's the first Jewish person elected to the British Parliament, so he's elected to Parliament, but the problem is that in Britain in the 1840s, you still have to, in order to take up your seat in Parliament, you have to swear the oath.
That's right.
On the Bible that you believe in Christian God, which of course he can't swear. And it's actually in the Australian press as well that there's all kinds of discussion, mostly affirmative, affirming Rothschild's right to freedom of conscience and that he could swear on the Torah and not talk about the Christian God, but rather Jehovah. So there's actually all kinds of discussions in Australian history. Yeah, that's really the first thing. Yep.
Does this stem from? You said it stems from the Catholic Emancipation Act, particularly these discussions. Is that an issue here? Like, is the status of Roman Catholics an issue here in colonial Australia at that time?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, there's debate about all kinds of issues about, whether or not, having priests and, the rights of Catholics, and then, whether or not the government. So in 1836, there's a Church Act in New South Wales, and there's, questions about, well, should this Church Act enable Roman Catholics to fund churches and so forth? In other words, using government money to support. Yeah, so there's all kinds of discussions about that.
Yeah, okay. And so you said that was the first broad thing you're going to say. Do you want to go on to the next thing?
Yes. So I guess, another thing is that increasingly we see a kind of process where understandings of religious liberty per se, there's this kind of, there's a theological element, and yet it is something that's engaged, debates that are engaged in by the broader population, and freedom of conscience bears its kind of theological underpinnings, and yet at the same time becomes like a broader issue too. So, and we see this particularly in the terms of conscientious objection to military service. Yeah. So, like in the early 20th century, as people probably know, all kinds of debates about military service and conscientious objection and conscription and so forth. But it's just a kind of interesting little vignette of all this is that the Commonwealth Defence Act in 1902 talks about, so there's a provision for conscientious objection on the basis of religious beliefs. And then throughout the next 20 years or so, there's a revision to that act in 1910, then in the 20s. And basically the character of that provision goes from being a religious provision to just being a broader provision based on belief.
Yeah.
And so, it's just a lovely example of the way that actually these ideas that are within the kind of, they begin as kind of Christian theological ideas, they are actually debated quite widely in public debate. And of course, there are atheists who are pacifists, particularly, who can actually claim that kind of right as well. And so there are also people who kind of situations where atheists kind of can claim conscience, like rights of conscience too, which is another really interesting thing. And there's a third thing too, but I don't know if you want me to.
Yes, please do. No, I'm very interested. So go on. Yeah.
So the third thing, and I think in a lot of ways, this is the most fascinating, also the most complex, and also the part where my research is really just starting to head.
Okay.
But this is the fact that actually the Aboriginal land rights movement has used its own intellectual traditions, but also the traditions of claiming rights in their sort of conventional tradition, has relied upon the idea of the sacred character of Aboriginal land in order to make rights claims, in order to make land rights claims. So there are different examples of this, but like in the famous and what's often taken as the origin of the sort of modern quote unquote land rights movement, the Yirrkala Bark petition in 1963. So the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land petitioned the federal government against the excise of some of their land, because, and the claim is that it has, one of the important claims is that that land has a kind of sacred significance.
Yes.
Sacred places there. And one of the reasons why this is, I think, really important to me and part of this history is that we haven't really recognized or even studied the fact that if we are interested in the history of the idea of religious liberty in Australia, we have to recognize that actually the history of that idea incorporates a whole history of colonial settler relations with Aboriginal people as well.
Yes.
And actually involves a history where Aboriginal people have drawn upon their own intellectual traditions in terms of like their own understanding that land is sacred and so forth. And yet at the same time have also drawn upon and used for their own ends, their own purposes, Western traditions of talking about inherent rights and so forth. And so actually so many of that, I think, elements of the history of the land rights movement are actually part of this history and should be part of our understanding of religious liberty.
Yeah.
And so,
very interesting.
We haven't really looked at that, partly because there's sort of, I think, obviously there are all kinds of, they're brilliant historians of like legal historians and historians of Indigenous history in Australia. But yeah, for whatever reason, there hasn't really been a kind of coming together of sort of intellectual history of idea of religious freedom and this understanding of land rights and how those claims have worked.
That sounds like a fascinating and very fertile thing to be digging into, and it's exciting that you're just starting to uncover some of that. So, be very interested to hear where that heads. Just very quickly, Section 116 of the Australian Constitution is obviously bandied about as our kind of equivalent sort of religious freedom clause, but it doesn't really get us very far, does it, in that conversation? And is this playing a role in your research at all? It's fairly limited. I read it as fairly limited. Doesn't really do much for us, I don't think, does it?
Yeah. No, it's basically a limit, as legal historians like Luke Beck and Caroline Evans have pointed out, like it's really a limit on the powers of the federal government. And so it's conceiving of this whole issue in terms of how do we limit the federal government's powers, Commonwealth powers. And so there's all kinds of interesting inferences from that in terms of like the history of like the rights of states. It doesn't say anything about the rights of states. No. There's no Bill of Rights, which again is like an example of the fact that the way that some public discourse is carried on, and particularly like obviously, you know, we're both in university context, we're both in touch with a lot of grad students, undergraduates. Many people think of the Australian situation in terms of thinking that they have almost the equivalent of like a Bill of Rights, like Americans, and don't actually realise, perhaps unless they're law students, that might be the one exception, hopefully, don't actually realise there's no Bill of Rights here. Like this is not how the Australian situation has worked at all. So they're very limited. It's really about how do we limit the Commonwealth's powers.
Very good. So it sounds like you've got a lot of interesting material that you're working on. What's the plan for the rest of the project? Do you have a book on the way? You're going to publish some articles. What's your plan at this stage?
So look, it's a really large project. There are some articles. So 2 in press, another one about to go out. So I work at the moment on the mid-19th century colonial New South Wales. But the plan is this is really a kind of 3 to 4 year project for which I've applied for, you know, as you do, various funding sources. But hopefully, yes, I do have some funding to employ a research assistant. And so like really one of the next stages is to go and really get into the history, especially Indigenous history, access in Canberra.
Fantastic.
And there would be a book. Yes.
Great. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. Again, just to finish the conversation, Sarah, what do you hope people can gain from this research? You said at the start that we have a real lack of historical consciousness in terms of our understanding of ourselves and our society. I presume you wanted to contribute to that, but what are some things that people should be able to take away from this at the end of reading your material on this important historical topic?
I think first of all, I would hope that the kind of research I'm producing is going to equip people to understand the current debate and actually equip them to kind of have meaningful, thoughtful, genuine, kind of informed discussions about contemporary issues that can actually draw upon the history and understand, for example, a term like right or free exercise, or particular examples when they're bandied around.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm really hoping to kind of equip people to participate in public debate, because there's clearly, it is a kind of sad thing when an important issue becomes merely, it's not that it is merely, but becomes increasingly subject to just kind of polemic rather than reasoned, thoughtful, historical discussion. And also when it becomes only a kind of political football. I'd love to see a kind of situation where people, we live in a society in which we are equipped to read and to educate ourselves, and in which we're able to have a kind of rich public discourse about these kind of ideas that is historically informed. And I guess too, so that's the kind of first thing about equipping people with the actual kind of intellectual tools to participate in this kind of debate. But I guess the second thing is the broader point, really about the importance of reading history and engaging with the past more generally. I mean, I've been thinking a lot recently and talking a lot with my husband and other friends and colleagues about how important it is to actually, we live in a culture which is increasingly competing for our attention, where time that is spent just on screens and in technology and just on entertainment, to be honest, and consumerism is just threatening to take over our minds. And I think now I'm just kind of speaking not as a historian, but as a Christian, that engaging with ideas, engaging with history and reading and educating yourself about the world is only going to enable us to have a richer understanding of the world that is created, how broken it is, how we can involve ourselves in it. And I think that we have to fight for, even on a personal level, we must be disciplined and engaged in fighting for the importance of education in our cultures and in our churches.
That's great, Sarah. That's really, I'm really, look, this is a fascinating project that you're working on. Thanks for taking the time to join me on the podcast. I've really enjoyed our time together. It's been great to talk history and religious freedom.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. It's been a lot of fun.
And thanks to our listeners and viewers for joining us on the Millis Podcast. We'll see you again next time.